Bang. So last month we finished off the letter E, part 1, with Emma's Revolution, the lesbian folk band. And now we're going to charge on through to the next thing, which is government. And first under government is Edward Everett. We could have put Edward Everett under education. In his 20s, he taught Greek to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course others at Harvard. And in his 50s, he was the president of Harvard for 3 years. But as a young teacher, Edward himself wrote, quote, "I die daily of a cramped spirit, fluttering and beating from side to side of a cage," unquote. Edward saw his future in politics and oratory, and he was right. From age 30 to 60, Edward held elected and appointed government jobs: congressman, governor of Massachusetts, minister to Great Britain, U.S. Secretary of State, and U.S. Senator. And in November 1863, at the dedication of a new military cemetery, Edward gave the other Gettysburg Address. For 2 hours, he gave a stirring speech, often moving his audience to tears. I shall now read it in its entirety. No? Okay, you're right. Tastes in oratory have changed. As Lincoln predicted, Everett's speech was little noted and not long remembered. The next speaker was Abraham Lincoln, who read for 2 minutes and received a polite smattering of applause, 77 years ago. I won't read that in its entirety either, but many of us, even as Canadians, know it by heart. Edward wrote to Lincoln afterwards praising his, quote, "eloquent simplicity and appropriateness," and said, quote, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Lincoln replied, "In our respective parts yesterday, you could not have been excused to make a short address, nor I a long one." Here's Thomas H. Eliot. Thomas Hopkinson Eliot was a Harvard lawyer and professor, and grandson of Harvard's Charles William Eliot. He was a chancellor at William Greenleaf Eliot's Washington University in St. Louis, keeping it all in the family, and he spent 2 years as a U.S. congressman from Massachusetts. He also spent time as a government lawyer, and his academic field was constitutional law. The website socialwelfarehistory.com praises his skill at writing social legislation, such as the old age insurance program, so it can stand up against constitutional challenges in the U.S. Supreme Court. Here comes Leonard Evans, who the last time I checked, I'm happy to say was still alive. He was a Manitoba MPP. He was a member of the provincial parliament for the NDP from 1967 until his retirement in 1999. He was an NDP cabinet member for Ed Schreier and Howard Pawley, holding various economic posts. Leonard was against Brian Mulroney's Meech Lake Accord in 1990. You may recall that under Manitoba's unusual rules, a unanimous vote was required to pass the accord. Leonard would have voted against it, but he stood aside and allowed Aboriginal MPP Elia Harper to be the only dissenter to provide publicity for the issue of Aboriginal rights. I applaud that decision. Showmanship can be an important tool in changing public opinion, and Evans and Harper helped change opinions in a good direction. That's it for government under the E's. We're moving on to science and technology. And our first guy was John Evans. For those of you on the phone, his middle name is Welsh, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it.
Yes.
He was a paleographic expert, a student of ancient Welsh texts. He published a multi-volume series of Old Welsh texts, receiving an honorary master's degree and later an honorary doctorate from Oxford for his work. And more important than a bunch of Welsh writing on stone, not that I'm putting that down, that's important too, but this is Martha May Eliot. Martha May Eliot was a granddaughter of William Greenleaf Eliot. She was a pediatrician, and she is the reason that few or none of us have had rickets. Martha's research showed that public policy, such as enriching common foods like bread with vitamin D, can inexpensively eradicate deficiency diseases. Martha got her doctorate. The other big one, of course, is potassium in table salt, which vitamin D in bread and milk got rid of rickets, and the potassium in salt got rid of thyroid problems. I think that's what it did. It's a big one anyway. Martha got a doctorate from Johns Hopkins University, then taught pediatrics at Yale. At the same time, she was bureau chief at the National Children's Bureau Division of Child and Maternal Health. When she retired from there at age 65, she became department chairman of Child and Maternal Health at Harvard School of Public Health. She also held important posts in the World Health Organization and UNICEF, and was the first woman president of the American Public Health Association. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but several prominent public health pioneers have been lesbians. Martha was 19 when she first met Ethel Collins Dunham, and the two remained life partners until Ethel's death more than 50 years later. Ethel was also a pediatric social doctor, and the two women became the first and second women to win the American Public Health Association's prestigious John Howland Award. And I should have clicked over to that picture earlier. I'm going to put a note into myself to do that next time. Note accomplished. That's the end of science and technology. Religion is our big section today. And we're starting in 1663 with Thomas Emlyn. My little paragraph title for him is Patient Zero. Thomas Emlyn was an English Presbyterian minister who moved to Ireland. He was the first British minister to describe himself as Unitarian. For this blasphemy, he was sentenced to a year in prison that stretched to 2 years, and a 1,000 pound fine that was eventually forgiven upon payment of 90 pounds. Of his imprisonment at age 40, Thomas said, quote, "I thank God that he did not call me to this lot of suffering till I had arrived at maturity of judgment and firmness of revolution, and that he did not desert me when my friends did." Oh, bam, zing. I bet his friends blushed. But perhaps Thomas was right to blame them. Let's move ahead 70 years and compare the fate of Edward Evanson. Edward Evanson was a middle-aged Church of England vicar in Tewkesbury near Gloucester. He got into trouble, not without cause, for reading the Bible from the pulpit and making it up as he went along. He would skip or alter parts that did not agree with him, and he would point out errors in the translation. He found plenty to complain about. He thought that most books and letters in the New Testament were forgeries, actually an opinion that many scholars share today. Of the four Gospels, he accepted only Luke as authentic. His 1773 Easter sermon got him arrested, and he went on trial. But many parishioners signed a petition in his favor. His friends did not desert him, and the authorities dismissed the case on a technicality. Edward was allowed to continue his preaching and writing. In his 70s, he led an officially Unitarian congregation down south in Devonshire. Here comes William Emerson Sr. He was the town minister in Concord, Massachusetts. He is too early in time to be an official Unitarian, but he is in the show because reasons. When American rebel set up the Massachusetts Provisional Congress in Concord, he became their chaplain. He was gung-ho. He preached against the British many a Sunday. When war began, he was a chaplain in the Continental Army. But I'm sorry to say he died of camp fever at age 33 while returning from the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. William left behind a widow and 5 kids living in this lovely home beside Concord's North River, built for him in 1770. A minister's home is called a manse, and this will later be called the Old Manse. It's one of America's most famous homes. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Nathaniel Hawthorne each spent time living and writing here. So that was William Emerson Sr. Here is William Emerson Jr. Sure enough, this is Senior's son, and he saw the Battle of Concord from an upstairs window of the Old Manse at the age of 6. He grew up to attend Harvard and become a minister, a Unitarian minister, for the town of Harvard and for the city of Boston. They say 3 times is a charm, and the 3rd generation of ministers in the Emerson family was Ralph Waldo Emerson, essayist and transcendentalist, who was quoted at the start or end of many UU services. He should perhaps be under agents of change. His ideas had a great influence on American philosophy and literature, not just on Unitarian thought. Waldo went to Harvard at age 14 and divinity school at 21. He became a junior pastor at Boston's Second Church, age 26. He married 18-year-old Ellen Tucker the same year, and things looked rosy. But things weren't rosy. Ellen contracted tuberculosis, the 19th century equivalent to AIDS or cancer, a lingering, often fatal disease. She died before her 20th birthday. Waldo also lost 2 younger brothers to TB. In his grief, Waldo did things we probably wouldn't, like visit Ellen's tomb after 7 weeks and open the coffin. He also did things that people still do, like question his faith. He had intellectual doubts, too. His older brother William studied biblical criticism in Germany and shared his thoughts with Waldo. And so in 1832, Waldo left the ministry. He spent a year traveling in Europe. He met 26-year-old John Stuart Mill in Rome and made a lifelong friend of the historian Thomas Carlyle. He visited Voltaire's home in Switzerland. He met the aging English poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Waldo returned to America and lived a year with his mother near Cambridge, writing. In 1834, he moved to Concord, not back to Concord. His grandparents were from there. His parents were from Boston. He moved back to Concord and stayed at the Old Manse with his step-grandfather, Ezra Ripley. He was lionized from the day he arrived. He gave a speech in 1835 to celebrate the town's 200th anniversary. He was like Greta Vosper, a minister who had renounced his faith and had interesting things to say about that. And he was a world traveler. He will spend his life as a philosopher, writing essays and touring the lecture circuit. Let me just close off this. Waldo had inherited money from his first wife. He bought a house. Oops, okay. After that brief introduction, we're backing up 1 paragraph. Waldo was in Concord to stay, but he didn't stay for long at the Old Manse. He proposed to Lydia Jackson. Waldo called her Lydian, apparently so his Boston friends wouldn't call her Lydier. She was a bright woman in her early 30s. She fell in love with Waldo at a party after one of his lectures. Waldo had inherited money from his first wife. He bought a house, named it Bush, and moved in after the wedding. It was a good marriage with 4 children. Lydian was often ill, partly from mercury-laced medicine that she took, but she still lived to age 90. She supported abolition, women's rights, indigenous rights, and animal welfare, and she pushed Waldo to do the same. Next year, Waldo published his groundbreaking essay, Nature. He said that direct study of nature in all its aspects was the gateway to understanding. Understanding of nature and of ourselves and of the divine. To fully experience the world, escape the distractions of human society and seek solitude. We need nature for 7 reasons. Commodity, providing for our needs. Beauty, delighting us. Language, as common ground for communicating. Discipline, or understanding the world. And for idealism, spirit, and prospects. Waldo followed that success with The American Scholar, delivered to Harvard's Phi Beta Kappa Society. He spoke on finding an elevated state of mind. He told Americans to seek answers from nature. Don't wait for revelations from Europe or Asia. Develop original American ideas and an American literary voice. It was well received. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was 6 years older, called it, quote, the Declaration of Independence of American Intellectual Life. Waldo had no such luck a year later with his divinity school address. The audience was Harvard's Divinity's graduating class. It's an important speech, and I'd always pictured an auditorium full of students, but actually just 6 out of the 7 graduates attended. Harvard hoped that they would get the same all-American rah-rah that Waldo gave to the Phi Beta Kappas. But instead, Waldo reminded these brand new ministers of why he had quit the ministry. He told them a lot of the Bible was nonsense, and conscience was the best moral guide. And Harvard didn't invite him back for 30 years. He is forgiven now. This is the plaque in this chapel on July 15, 1838. Ralph Waldo Emerson read his divinity school address. Acquaint thyself at first hand with deity. Waldo soon found himself at the center of American thought. He influenced writers like Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Walt Whitman, and thinkers like Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, and Bronson Alcott. He was godfather to William James, and he pretty much invented the lecture circuit, earning much needed money through frequent public appearances. Emerson is one of my UU heroes. As a hero, he is a real deal, but he's not the full package. He was generous to his friends, but he could be deaf to appeals from charitable organizations, and he was skeptical of social experiments. There was a bit of Ayn Rand in him. He practiced self-reliance, and he expected it from others. We tell our children that UU is the church of the open mind, the loving heart, and the helping hands. Emerson was all about the open mind. In 1836, actually the day before he published his essay, Nature, Waldo went to a party in Boston for 12 philosophers and Unitarian ministers. It was organized by George Ripley and William Channing. One attendee was Frederick Hedge, who had come all the way from Maine. The party went well, and they decided to make it a regular thing. Since Hedge had come so far, they named it Hedge's Club and said that they'd meet whenever he was in town. After Nature was published, a critic disparagingly called Waldo's views, quote, transcendentalist, unquote. Well, Waldo and his friends liked the name, and they claimed it for themselves. They are the Transcendental Club, and their works are the Transcendentalist movement. Transcendentalism was, to some extent, an American romantic movement, a backlash against the rationalism and scientific progress of the Enlightenment. Like the romantic movements in Europe, it aimed to put humans and the human experience back at the center of literature and philosophy. The Transcendental Club was men only in the first year, after which Waldo introduced Margaret Fuller and other women to the group. Fuller became editor of The Dial, a magazine founded in 1840. Along with the writings of Emerson and Thoreau, The Dial was the third main way in which transcendental ideas became known outside the club. Waldo toured the lecture circuit, but always returned to his home in Concord. Kindred spirits settled there to be near him, and Concord became something of a UU mecca. Young Henry David Thoreau was Emerson's handyman and a tutor to his children. When Thoreau decided to live a contemplative life for 2 years, he got permission to build a cabin on Waldo's land beside Walden Pond. Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody rented the old manse from Waldo for their honeymoon. After Hawthorne became successful, they returned to Concord and bought a house. Waldo was one of the true believers who backed educational reformer Bronson Alcott through a long, long series of failures. The Alcott settled in Concord because the cost of living was lower there. Louisa May Alcott spent much of her childhood there and returned to settle there as an adult. The poet Ellery Channing settled in Concord and took long walks with Waldo. In 1864, at age 61, Waldo was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Science. In 1872, his house burnt down. The townfolk rallied round and raised money to rebuild. Waldo, age 69, was a real celebrity now. When he returned from a trip to Europe in 1873, school was let out for the day. Pardon me. Not my COVID cough, just my normal winter cough. I'm just kind of demonstrating how Waldo's health was declining, actually. His health began a slow decline in 1867. By 1872, he had his first memory problems. By 1880, the question, "How are you?" was always answered, "Quite well. I have lost my mental faculties, but I am perfectly well." In April 1882, Ralph Waldo Emerson, known even then as the Concord Sage, died at 79. Waldo did have his critics. His contemporary Edgar Allan Poe said, "He belongs to a class of gentlemen with whom we have no patience whatsoever. The mystics for mysticism's sake." The best answer to this quaddle is cui bono, a very little Latin phrase very generally mistranslated and misunderstood. Cui bono, to whom is it a benefit? If not to Mr. Emerson individually, then surely to no man, unquote. His friend Thomas Carlyle once called him, quote, "a hoary-headed and toothless baboon," unquote, which seems a little harsh when Waldo was 8 years younger than Carlyle and wrote a nice introduction for one of Carlyle's books. One criticism was that Waldo lacked a sense of evil. He always remained an optimist. Despite America's faults, it has some of that spirit, and Ralph Waldo Emerson helped put it there. His optimism persisted despite sadness through the deaths of 3 siblings in childhood, of a father when he was 8, of a 20-year-old wife, of a 5-year-old son, and of 3 adult brothers who predeceased him. He said if he were sent to hell, he would make a heaven of it. If hell does exist, I doubt he was given the chance to try. Here comes Sallie Ellis of the Post Office Missions. Sallie Ellis was the daughter of a Unitarian minister in Cincinnati. At the age of 25, she had the misfortune to suffer from vertigo, hearing loss, and tuberculosis, becoming a permanent invalid. However, it led her in fruitful directions. She took over the book and tract table at the church and developed it, first into a lending library and then into the first Unitarian post office mission, mailing books and news to other congregations and receiving theirs in return. It became known as Miss Ellis's mission. Other Unitarian and Universalist congregations copied her model, and a post office mission in Jamaica Plain in Boston corresponded with 400 people overseas. The idea spread to London, England, which corresponded throughout the British Empire. These beginnings were the start of today's Church of the Larger Fellowship. Next comes Thomas Lamb Eliot, like father, like son. Thomas Lamb Eliot is another son of William Greenleaf Eliot. He went to Portland, Oregon. Like his father in St. Louis, he preached and practiced the civic gospel, taking his message and practical help where they were most needed, to jails, mental asylums, schools, orphanages, and First Nations reservations. Wouldn't that be exciting, building the social services for a whole city from scratch? Thomas received honorary degrees from Harvard in Boston, Washington University in St. Louis, and Reed College in Portland. This is Annis Ford Eastman. She started as a Congregationalist minister, but became more liberal with time and ended her days as a Unitarian. She was a feminist and spoke at the Congress of Women at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Annis made it into the show with a boost from two semi-famous children. Crystal Eastman and Roger Baldwin co-founded what became the American Civil Liberties Union. Max Eastman was a Greenwich Village intellectual and editor of socialist papers like The Liberator and The Masses. Next comes Samuel Atkins Eliot II. He was the first president of the American Unitarian Association from 1900 to 27. 1900, well, the AUA was founded in 1825, so I need to explain how he could be the first president. After graduating from Harvard, Samuel served far-flung congregations in Seattle, Denver, and Brooklyn. At age 38, he returned to Boston and took the top job in the AUA, which had the title secretary. He said, "Please, call me president." So they did. But it wasn't just a change of title. Samuel made leadership of the AUA an executive position rather than a presiding position, and he transformed the organization. What his father, Charles William Eliot, did for Harvard, making it rich, Samuel did for the AUA. He pulled wealthy Unitarians onto the board. He used their resources to turn the AUA into a financial powerhouse that helped member congregations with public advocacy, Sunday school curriculum, and ministerial credentialing. He believed in the civic gospel and established the first Department of Social Justice within the AUA. I think we can all agree he did a lot of good. We can still disagree with some of his initiatives, though. He withdrew fellowship from ministers against American involvement in World War I. He excluded women from AUA leadership and discouraged women from becoming ministers. Samuel was also a significant historian. He wrote the Biographical History of Massachusetts and a 4-volume biographical history of Unitarianism, and a history of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Here's Roger Etz. In one way, Roger Etz was to the Universalists what Samuel Atkins Eliot was to the Unitarians, the leader of the Universalist General Convention from 1919 to 1937. However, he did not enjoy the same success, in part because Universalists rejected the centralizing tendency that proved so successful for Unitarians. No title of president for Roger. The Universalists had only 2 paid employees at the national level in 1919, and they reduced it to 1, just Roger, in 1928. During the Great Depression, he took a 10% pay cut. Frankly, the Universalist Church was in free fall during his tenure. Even so, he is credited with keeping it as a going concern and making possible the consolidation with the Unitarians in 1961. Frederick May Eliot. So, where did all those disappearing Universalists go? I expect some of them went to Frederick May Eliot's AUA. Frederick was president from 1937 to 58, and AUA membership more than doubled during his tenure. The period is called the Unitarian 20th Century Renaissance. Under this president, Melvin Arnold expanded the Unitarian publishing house, Beacon Press. Sophia Leon Faz revised the RE program. Monroe Husbands created the Church of the Larger Fellowship, serving isolated, unchurched Unitarians. Waitstill and Martha Sharp began the Unitarian Service Committee to help refugees from Hitler's Europe. And it was no accident that this happened under Frederick. Frederick had achieved the same growth and more as a parish minister in St. Paul, Minnesota. Frederick is the last of our Eliots, so let's review them. All the I seem to have these slides in a bit of a funny order, so let's just smile and wave to the 3 children here, Frederick, Martha, and Abigail, all of whom show up in the show. And I'm on to the next slide. Because Frederick is the last of our Eliots, so let's review them. All of the American Eliots trace back to Andrew Eliot and his son, Andrew Eliot, both of whom came over from England around 1669. And then there's a whole bunch of people that we don't care about. And then in the 19th and 20th century, there were 2 important Unitarian branches. William Greenleaf Eliot moved to St. Louis and had many children, including Henry Christopher and Thomas. Thomas helped build Portland, Oregon. Henry the brickmaker married Charlotte, and their son was T.S. Eliot. Christopher had 3 children, Frederick, Martha, and Abigail. The 4 children, T.S. Eliot and the other 3, they used to play together on Boston Commons. Meanwhile, a different branch of the Eliots, descended from bankers and mayors, gave us Charles William of Harvard, his son Samuel Atkins of the AUA, and his son Thomas, the lawyer, congressman, and professor of constitutional law. That's our Eliots. It's not our last guy for the day. That would be David Eaton. In 1968, All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. prepared a profile to search for a new minister. It inspired this poem from a member of the congregation. Our profile composed now amidst autumn breezes, our standards so high we've disqualified Jesus. The minister they called to meet that high standard was David Eaton, the first black senior minister in a major UU church. All Souls hired him with approval from 89% of the mostly white congregation, even though he described himself in the job interview as, quote, a black man first, an individual second, unquote. 1968-69 was, of course, a time of crisis for Black America and for the UUA. Blacks were only 1% of UUA membership nationwide, but they were up to 1/3 of the congregation in some major urban areas like Washington, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. In April '68, Martin Luther King was assassinated. In May '68, the UUA General Assembly in Cleveland voted to give $250,000 per year for 4 years to an all-black caucus called BAC, for Black Affairs Council. That was 1/8 of the UUA annual budget. It was a vote of support for young, radical black UUs. Well, if Samuel Atkins and his deep-pocketed friends had still been leading the UUA, the plan might have proceeded as voted. But the UUA had been spending high throughout the 60s in an attempt to grow. When the trustees met, they saw that there were no discretionary funds at all. Existing programs had to be cut. Where would the money for BAC come from, and would it come at all? The next year in '69, at the UUA General Assembly in Boston, the budget proposed giving BAC $200,000 instead of $250,000. Over 100 black delegates walked out in protest, followed by hundreds of their white supporters. When the UUA board met in Washington, faced with a budget deficit over $1 million, they funded the BAC. The funding to BAC and also to liberal religious youth and to regional offices was indeed reduced to the $200,000 in the case of BAC. To BAC, it felt like betrayal. Over the next couple of years, 1,000 black UUs left the movement. Black membership would never fully recover. Eaton threw All Souls right into the middle of the controversy. After his first 6 weeks, only 6 weeks, he loaned his pulpit to a man from a black called Black United Front. The man requested $250,000 from the All Souls congregation. That's what we might now call a Truth and Reconciliation donation. It would be the same thing if a First Nations elder came to Don Heights and asked us to turn over our investment fund. The congregation didn't do it, but a few months later, they did purchase $200,000 worth of a high-risk, low-interest bond issued by BAC. Sorry to say, the bond issue did not go well. There were charges of depletion of funds and procedural irregularities. There were lawsuits between two competing BAC factions within BAC, and there was a split in the organization. In the end, BAC just invested the remaining money in conventional investments while the lawsuits went forward in order to pay back most of the loan with the agreed 5% annual interest. After years, I still don't understand the crisis well. I've been getting help recently reading an excellent book on it. But anyway, here's my best summary. Difficult problems, good intentions on both sides, unfortunate circumstances, poor execution on both sides, and disastrous results. The UUA used to call it the empowerment controversy. Now they call it the empowerment tragedy. In May 1970, David preached a sermon called "Take the Blindfold Off the Lady." This is under Nixon now. He denounced the new DC omnibus crime bill that allowed no-knock searches of suspects' homes. Eaton said, quote, "If this legislation is passed, I suggest to you and instruct myself, anytime persons break into your house unannounced, shoot them." That got a gasp from the congregation and criticism in the press. But it accomplished its goal. The final version of the bill included protection for civil rights. There were other UU congregations in DC, and not everyone stayed at All Souls. They lost some white members and gained some black, which reflected the changing demographics in downtown Washington, too. But All Souls remained a mixed congregation, and they kept Eaton for 20 years, making him minister emeritus when he finally retired shortly before his death. For some of these anecdotes, I'd like to thank Darkening the Doorways by Mark Morrison Reed and the UU History film series Long Strange Trip by Ron Cordes. Actually, Mark Morrison Reed has recently released a new book specifically about the Black empowerment tragedy, and I'm thinking some summer I might make that my standalone topic. Venturing into risky ground as a privileged white onlooker, it'd be easy for me to say the wrong thing, but it's an important story. And that is the end of today's story. So I should find the record button and turn it off.